This is my evaluation of Blondie, which was the final performance of our political theatre term. I'm going to start by talking about the music, which was of course a key Brechtian element. We chose to take two songs, a song by Blondie and a song called Hot Stepper, Foot Stepper, something like that, and we changed the lyrics in the hope that we would get the message across that we were taking something recognisable and something that the audience knew, and we were putting a twist on it and we were changing it, which was the whole message of Blondie, the false expectation, you think you know something and of course it's not what you think it is. And that's the whole idea of Blondie. The duologues were a way of showing another key Brechtian feature, which was the idea of stereotypes, which we pushed as far as we could, and in actual fact I think I could have pushed my stereotype a bit further. I think I fell a bit short of the mark, but that's something to work on. But yeah, the duologues were a good way of introducing the plot, the synopsis for the whole play, and also we had two scenes for the duologues, for each duologue. We had the principal scene and then we had the final scene, and during the principal scene we got to know the stereotypes, and so in the concluding scenes we kind of cared what they had to say, and I hope the audience felt the same. I hope the audience wanted to know what these characters had to say at the end. Obviously Brecht was very keen on the idea of stereotypes, so the stereotypes that we portrayed were hopefully recognisable to the audience, and hopefully they were stereotypes that the audience has encountered and will continue to encounter, because this would make the message of the piece all the more poignant. The live video feed I think was the most interesting thing I've ever done in a performance. I think it was pretty risky, it was quite difficult to accomplish, but I think it really worked, and speaking to the audience members afterwards, I think it was a really interesting, not overly complex way of using different mediums and elements in a very Brechtian way. Of course, Brecht openly encouraged using different mediums and elements, so it was a very modern way of doing that, a modern way of modern way of using Brecht's ideas. So the video feed was very useful for us as actors, of course, because we didn't have to rely on, presenting our ways in quite a typical way. We could use the camera which was circling around us to portray facial expression, and we had that kind of close-up on our faces sometimes. So I think that really helped the audience as well, because it alienated them, because it reminded them of the performance, because they could see themselves on screen, they could see, they could see the stage, they could see everything on the screen, but at the same time it drew them in to the plot, because it was a really interesting way of showing the story. The characters in Power, I'd like to point out and focus on Paris's performance as Bin Laden, which I think was a perfect example of why stereotypes in a Brechtian performance are good. Paris pushed his stereotype to the brink, and he used it as much as he could, and the comic relief that he supplied during his piece really contrasted against the quite heavy hitting message that his group had, which was all about 9/11 and the train bombings in London. So of course the comic relief was much needed, and it really was a relief for the audience, because we were kind of laughing with anxious surprise, really. We were taken aback by the message of the piece, and Paris's character and stereotype really helped the audience understand the message. I think the stereotype is something I could work on again. a lot more for my George Bush scene. I wish I'd pushed the stereotype a bit further, rather than just portraying him as this sort of hillbilly Forrest Gump type character, because although he was a recognisable character in himself, I think it would have been more interesting and perhaps more Brechtian to supply a stereotype for it. But nonetheless, I think the George Bush was fine as it was, because the audience understood the message about the oil, and yeah. Going on to my own performance, carrying on from George Bush, again, for the office worker, I think I should have pushed the stereotype a bit further. In our rehearsal process, we were looking at taking a stance, how your character would stand, then exaggerating it, and exaggerating it even further. So I think I fell a bit short of that final exaggeration, because I think although the character was humorous and was recognisable again, just like George Bush, I don't think it kind of fulfilled a massive stereotype. And although it was my own interpretation of the character, I think it's something that I could have worked on a bit more. As C, I think I did well to portray and carry on the characteristics that the other actors who played C had created. I tried to take what they had done and bring it into my own performance, but then add my own ideas and thoughts and characteristics onto it. So in the hope that by the end of the performance the audience had seen a kind of growth of the character, a kind of a gradual explanation of the character. So yeah, that's something that I try to work on as much as possible, without just going on a wild one and adding my own complete new irrelevant interpretation of the character, because I think there's quite a fine line between simply adding your own thoughts and ideas onto a character and then taking it into your own sort of world and doing it your way. So yeah, that's something I try to do. On the subject of the audience, I think the audience has a lot to do with a political performance, the success or the, you know, the relevance of it. We performed it twice in front of a full audience. The first audience was in front of our own strand, which was our own age group, which I think was the more successful of the two, because I think the language and the jokes were more aimed at that age level, frankly. I think they understood and comprehended the political references and the messages that we were trying to get across. Whereas I think the second audience, which was our parents and family, perhaps didn't understand as many of the references and perhaps didn't find the humour as relevant, really. And I think perhaps only got about half of the references. So that's something to consider for future performances, especially future political performances, to consider your audience and the fact that your audience will not always be your own age group. You've got to consider the fact that they may be much older, and therefore you've got to accommodate to their own kind of humour, if you like. Obviously you can't predict what your audience is going to like, but you can certainly make a guess. And yeah, I think in hindsight that would be something to consider during the rehearsal process. Just the way we presented our piece, and perhaps the way we told some of the jokes. Overall I think the performance went really well, and I look forward to next term.